Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Talk about a game changer. As the CEO of the Oakland Raiders, Amy Trask served as the highest-ranking female executive in the NFL. She spent almost 30 years with the organization, working her way up from intern to CEO and trusted confidant of owner Al Davis. Today, she's a football analyst for CBS Sports and serves as chairman of the board of Ice Cube's Big Three. In her book, You Negotiate Like a Girl, Amy reflects on her career in the NFL and the leadership lessons she learned on her journey. We talk about how she carved her own path, her approach to negotiating, and why she never paid attention to gender despite often being the only woman in the room. Let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Amy Trask. Amy, it is such a pleasure to have you on. You know, you spent 30 years with the Raiders, and in many ways you grew up there. I mean, at least sort of professionally inside of the organization. How did that shape you as a leader?
In probably every way imaginable. I think I grew up on the job. Look, a lot of people start working when they're very young. Not that many, at least in my experience or observation, stay with one organization for almost 30 years. That certainly was the case many years ago, no longer the case, it seems, these days. So I really did grow up on the job, and I had to learn how to do many things in the manner that was best for me.
And so how did your leadership style evolve inside of that 30-year window of time?
Well, I'll hearken back to advice my mother gave me when I was a very, very young child. And she said this to me repeatedly, as only mothers can do. She said it over and over and over again. And as kids can do, I got to the point and the age where whenever she would mention it, I would roll my eyes. But it really is the best advice I've ever received, which is to thine own self be true. As a little bit of a footnote, it wasn't until I was almost out of college that I stumbled upon the fact that it was actually Shakespearean advice.
Go, Mom, taking credit for Shakespeare.
And I note that I stumbled on it because I do need, in full disclosure, to note that I never read Hamlet. I really did just stumble on the fact that the advice my mother gave me was from Hamlet, but whether it was Shakespeare or my mom, it was the best advice. It still is the best advice I've ever received. And I think it's so important when it comes to these issues of leadership. I don't believe that one can lead effectively if one is trying to be something or someone one is not.
No question.
I learned as I grew up to be myself and to lead as myself. And I therefore note when people ask me questions about my leadership style that what worked for me won't necessarily work for others. We all have to be and to lead in a manner that is true to ourselves.
No question. Wow, I agree with that totally, Amy. And speaking of, right, so the Raiders have such a unique organizational culture, which has been written and talked about, obviously, publicly quite a bit. For our listeners who maybe aren't sports fans, how would you describe the Raiders culture?
Well, I'll do that in two ways. And for those who are familiar with the Raiders, those who are sports fans, I will note this. There will be those of you or those among you who are Raider fans and those among you who cannot stand the Raiders, those among you who admired Al Davis, and those among you who couldn't stand him. But I would hope that if we're all being intellectually honest, we can recognize that he was so far ahead of his time. Heck, he's still far ahead of where people are now in terms of hiring without regard to race, gender, ethnicity, religion, or any other individuality, which has no bearing on whether one can do a job. And I was certainly a beneficiary of his vision. He hired me in the mid 80s. So again, I'm sure there are people listening to this who weren't even born then, but for him to hire and then hire a young woman and give me the opportunity to grow within the organization was not the norm at that time. As for the Raiders in general, for those of you who are not sports fans, what initially attracted me to the organization was its willingness to bring in those that other organizations had labeled behavior problems. That resonated with me. As a kindergartner, I was labeled a behavior problem, and that label stuck with me throughout all of my K through 12 years. Some people would tell you it's still appropriate, and it probably is. But the organization hired those that others would not hire, gave people second and third and fourth chances, and I liked that.
Mm-hmm. Sure, he believed in his people, it sounds like, and he gave him a chance.
Well, and people say, he was a tough man for whom to work. Well, tough is not necessarily bad. Demanding is not necessarily bad.
Right.
Exacting is not necessarily bad. He demanded no more of others than he demanded of himself. And what I loved was, to the extent he was demanding or rough or tough, it was equal opportunity. It was without discriminating based on any of those individualities I noted.
Mm-hmm. What was the most important lesson you learned from Al?
Wow. 30 years of magnificent lessons. All right. Here's one that I would put atop the list. The biggest misconception about Al is that he wouldn't tolerate anyone who would disagree with him. He wouldn't tolerate disagreement. Nothing could be further than the truth. If he would not tolerate disagreement or those who disagreed with him, I would have been fired roughly 2 weeks into my job. He walked into a room. I was sitting with a coworker, and he lit into that coworker in a manner I can only imagine a velociraptor would rip into flesh. And I sat there and I listened for a bit. And again, this is roughly 2 weeks into my employment. And I said to him, "Excuse me, you're wrong." And look, I don't have a dainty voice under the best of circumstances. And I will always remember the look on his face as his head swiveled around, kind of like Linda Blair in The Exorcist without the green stuff. And he looked at me, he was incredulous. And I said, "Excuse me, you're wrong." I said it again. I said, "If the facts upon which you were basing your conclusion were accurate, well, then that's a fair conclusion. But you are basing your conclusion on inaccurate information." And he yelled, and I yelled, and he yelled, and I yelled, and we went back and forth. As I said, I don't have a dainty voice. And I didn't realize at the time, but people had gathered in the hallway and they were listening, like, who's this young woman 2.5 weeks into her job screaming at the owner? And about 20 minutes in or so, he looked at me and said, "Oh, okay, I gotcha," or "I got it." And we just went on. And I have always believed that disagreement can be productive, disagreement can be healthy. And what I learned in that moment is other people understood that that was the case as well. And even those reputed for not tolerating disagreement could disagree in a productive, healthy manner. And I think that is imperative not only in business, but in life. Disagreement doesn't have to be disagreeable, and it can be beneficial.
Well, and you talk about leading with the facts, leading with the data.
Right.
Which is a powerful way to start a difficult conversation, right?
Right. And a great point you just raised, because that's what I learned that day. And it guided me throughout the next 30 years or almost 30 years of my career. If I wanted to disagree with Al, I came armed with data and facts and information. It wasn't sort of just disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing. It was, here's my data, here's my information, here's why I disagree. And I couldn't begin to count the number of just very, very intense disagreements we had. It often seemed to me that we disagreed far more than we agreed over the course of my career. But at the end of the disagreement, I recognized he owns the organization. It's ultimately his decision. And if he makes a decision with which I disagree, it is still my responsibility to try to effectuate his decision as best I can. And one thing for which I have no patience and no tolerance is, I don't know how to best describe this, but people who will say, okay, and then walk out and engage in a whisper campaign. Well, that wasn't my idea. I don't like that idea. I'm not in favor of this. No, 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 no. When you are part of an organization, whether you agree with the decision or not, it is the decision of the organization, and everybody needs to sit in that rowboat pulling their oars in the same direction.
You know, your advice has always been, and I'll quote you here, quote, "Stop thinking about your gender," end quote. Tell me about that.
It has always struck me as, I could use a big word like counterintuitive, or, is some such thing, but I will tell you the word that comes to mind is nutty. Just a bit nutty. If I want to walk into a room, an NFL owners meeting, a Raider team ownership meeting, a player meeting, a coaches meeting, a bankers meeting, a municipal meeting, any sort of meeting or circumstance whatsoever, with the expectation and the hope that nobody is going to be thinking about my gender, it doesn't make sense for me to be thinking about my gender. And that's why I come back to the word nutty. Why should I expect others to not think about my gender? Why should I hope that others will interact with me without regard to gender if I'm thinking about my gender? That's never made sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me.
Right. Interesting. I understand. And I know you hate the term work-life balance, and I want you to expand on that. Kind of why are we thinking about it wrong?
Well, and I don't know that others are thinking about it wrong, because, and thank you for recognizing that is a little peeve of mine.
I know, right, girl?
Right. Yeah.
I'm in your world.
A woman did her research, which of course anybody who follows you knows you always do. I love people who do that. It strikes me when people speak to me about work-life balance that they are imposing a judgment on me, or that they are imposing their world view on me. I have no issue whatsoever with anyone who wishes to define or to balance his or her life, whether it's work or any other aspect of life, as he or she wants. But to say to someone, we need work-life balance, or there should be focus on work-life balance, implies to me that others are making a judgment that this sort of balance is important to everyone. If one has the luxury of deciding how to jiggle and juggle all of the aspects of one's life, then one should get to do that as he or she wishes to do. And I note that it's a luxury because there are so many people in this world who cannot define a balance, if you will, as desired, because necessity dictates how one has to live one's life. But if you do have the luxury, you get to define it how you want. And there were many people over the course of my career who said, you work all the time. Well, number one, I didn't really consider it work in many regards.
You loved it.
I loved it. It was demanding. There were times it was, to the point where you wanted to yank your hair out by the roots. I'm not suggesting it wasn't all of those things, but I was doing what I wanted to do. So for someone to say to me, you need balance, my response was, you need to not worry about what I need. Go ahead and worry about your own life, and let me take care of mine, okay? To the extent I was going to have that discussion with anyone, it would only be my immediate family.
So tell me this, Al passed away in 2011, and you stepped down from the Raiders in 2013. Tell me a little bit about what went into that decision and what's transformed in your life, of course, since then has been pretty awesome. But tell me a little bit about that decision-making process for you.
I will, but not until I say that I was a fan of yours before this conversation and couldn't be a bigger fan than I am right now, because you ask just tremendous questions. Nobody has ever asked me that question in the manner you just articulated it. It was the hardest decision I have ever made in my life. And the footnote on that is, yes, I recognize, therefore, that I've had a terrific life, because people have to make much more excruciating decisions than I have had to make. But that was the hardest decision I've had to make in my life. And I labored with the decision for roughly 14 months. And the fact that I didn't drive my husband screaming from the house saying, stop it, is a testament to him. I was, to go back to Hamlet, I was to be or not to be for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I finally decided it was the right decision. And it turns out it was the right decision. Often in making decisions like that, one wonders, am I going to regret it? Am I going to think, oh, why did I do this? It was the wrong decision. Well, it was the right decision, and I haven't regretted it for one moment. That doesn't mean it wasn't a scary decision. Of course it was. And I was self-aware to get to your point of what I'm doing now, I was self-aware enough to know that until I stepped away, I would not be able to focus on what was next. So the morning after I let the team owner know that I was leaving, I woke up, looked at my husband and said, I am a blight on humanity. I have nothing to do. And his response was, enjoy it. Well, very, very shortly thereafter, I joined CBS Sports Network, CBS Sports, and since then have also joined Ice Cube's new Big Three basketball 3-on-3 league, the Big Three.
Which is very cool to see you in that role. So let's dig into negotiation, right? You wrote a book, You Negotiate Like a Girl. Tell me, what's the story behind the title of that book and what motivated you to want to write it?
I don't know that I could point to one thing in particular that motivated me to write it. I love to write. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of playing around right now with writing a children's book, and my quick disclaimer will be: fear not, there won't be swearing in the children's book as there is in You Negotiate Like a Girl. The story is that we were in the middle of a very, very intense negotiation. This was while I was with the Raiders, of course, and it was sort of existential in nature. And it was the deal that we were looking to put together, the process, the negotiations weren't going at the pace that Al wanted. They weren't going in the direction he wanted. He was becoming increasingly frustrated and angry. And at one point, he just blurted out, this was when we were discussing the status of a particular portion of that negotiation, you negotiate like a girl. And I looked at him and I just laughed and I said, okay, do it yourself. Now, mind you, I'd been there at this point, over 25 years. I knew that my gender was of no issue or concern to him whatsoever. This is a man who had advanced me from an unpaid internship to the CEO of the organization. Gender did not matter to him. He blurted it out and I just laughed and I said, okay, negotiate it yourself. And he got really, really angry and allowed as how he didn't want to negotiate it himself. He wanted the girl to negotiate it.
Well, it's a wonderful book. And to get our listeners a little bit inside, your world more, can you share some examples of maybe some of the things that you negotiated over your career and some of the things you learned along the way in those negotiations that our listeners could lift up and apply to their lives?
Well, if I may, I'll start with the latter part of your question. And I guess I'll address the first part and say, there were all sorts of negotiations. One aspect that people assume I handled, which I did not, and I want to be very clear about that. I wasn't involved in negotiations between the organization and player agents. So I wasn't involved in player contract negotiations. But any other business negotiation in which the organization was involved, I was involved. And what I learned through that process is to thine own self be true. I have a very, very different view of negotiating or negotiations than do, if not all the people I know, most of them. But as I sit here right now, I really think it's different than everyone with whom I've discussed this. I don't believe that negotiations need to be a quid pro quo. I don't believe there needs to be a tit for tat. I don't believe in power seats or power this. I always laugh when I read something or hear something about someone who enters a negotiation looking for the, quote, power seat, close quote. If someone does that while negotiating with me, they're wasting their time because I don't even know what that seat is. I don't care what that seat is. That's not the manner in which I approach a negotiation. There's a saying that I abhor, which is, let's sit across the table and negotiate with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Why not just sit side by side
Sure.
and collaborate with one another? If the goal of a negotiation is to reach a deal, then why not collaborate and see if you can reach a deal? So the way I proceed is as follows. When I'm working to reach a deal with someone, I explain to that person or those persons, this is what I need to make this deal work from my perspective or from our perspective. This is what I have to accomplish in order to strike a deal with you. So if there are things you need to accomplish, if there are elements of a deal that are of quintessential importance to you, tell me what they are. Because if they don't matter to me, you can have them. In other words, if you want to analogize it to poker, I'm turning my cards up and saying, here's what I need to make a deal work. If you need something I don't, have at it. And why don't you do the same with me? Because if the goal is to reach a deal, why don't we figure out how to reach a deal? I don't like game playing. I don't like, as I mentioned, a tit for tat, quid pro quo approach. Just see if you can make a deal. And at the end of the day, if you can't, because you each need things that are mutually exclusive from what the other needs, then you can't make a deal. But at least give it the best shot you can by trying to collaborate.
No question. It's a conversation, right?
Exactly.
I mean, negotiation's a conversation, yeah. You played such a key role in hammering out the deal that brought the team back to Oakland from LA in 95. Tell me about that negotiation.
Well, interestingly, the negotiation itself was actually handled by one of the limited partners for the Raiders, a gentleman who lived in the Bay Area and who was very close with Al, and he handled the negotiation with the municipality. So in that particular deal, I was more of a reviewer, if you will, and I looked at the aspects of the deal that had been negotiated, and I said to Al, here's what I think will work. Here's what I think will not work. He was very, very forthright with me. And that was one of the things I loved about our relationship. There was no game playing. He said, you're not negotiating this one. Jack is. And he allowed us how I could tell him what I didn't like about the deal, but his heart was in going back to Oakland. That's what he wanted. So my role was to then help him as best I could effectuate that decision.
Okay. When you look at the deals you've negotiated and you think about, I would imagine numerous negotiations, both internally and externally, what would you say is the number one thing that helped you be successful in collaborating inside a negotiation?
Wow, I guess I would turn to that very word, collaboration and honesty. Let me phrase it as a negative. I didn't play games.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I thought playing games in a negotiation was a waste of time. And I didn't look at negotiations, I still don't, as a zero-sum game. You go to some meetings and you see people who feel like they're keeping score and I won a point. Yay, I won a point. Well, who cares if you won anything? Did you achieve and accomplish that which is the best for your business, your organization, yourself? Did you reach a deal that works? I don't like gamesmanship. And some people would tell you that they think I'm wrong in that regard. That worked for me, not playing games.
Mm-hmm. What about internal negotiations? I mean, so many people that are listening deal with that. And from reading your book, it sounds like you had to do a ton of that. Tell me maybe a story about an internal negotiation, how you handled it, and something potentially that could be applied for our audience.
Well, I don't know if you would consider this a negotiation. And maybe I should back up and say, I think we're talking about the same thing, but I don't know that I would use the word negotiations because my view was that everyone in the organization was on the same team, both literally and figuratively. Of course, I'm using that,
Sure.
Not in just we didn't all necessarily suit up on game day, but we were all part of the same team. So I didn't view discussions internally as negotiations as much as problem solving. I will tell you the the problem solving, to use that expression, that still sits with me as the most, I don't know if I would say significant, or a better word, just special to me. The thing that I still feel is very, very special was the work I did to convince Al to allow me to settle all of the litigation in which the team was involved. Al felt very strongly about that litigation. I still act like an 8-year-old when I quickly point out, we were the defendant. We were the defendant. Al liked to countersue with a vengeance. But, he was very, very passionate in his views and his positions with respect to that litigation. And it was my firmly held view that litigation is not a good business strategy. And it took me many, many, many years to convince Al to allow me to get us out of all of that litigation. And I don't think of that so much as a negotiation with him as much as persuasion, or convincing him we should, or perhaps more precisely, I should describe it as convincing him to give me the leeway, or to trust me to do what I believed best in that regard. Maybe other people thought of that as a negotiation. I thought of it more as a discussion.
How did you do that? How did you get him to that place to let you go?
It took years.
Okay.
There's no one particular thing I could point to. It took years. And, he trusted me. Ultimately, he looked at me and trusted me. And I will never forget, and I apologize if I tear up and get a little choked up as I share this with you, when I brought all of the settlement documents in for him to sign.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked up at me and said, "I'm doing this for you, kid."
Oh, wow.
And it was just a very special moment.
Well, he trusted you, but you built that trust through the relationship over a long period of time, it sounds like.
It was a relationship that was built over a long time, and I trusted him.
Yeah. What would you say is the biggest mistake you see people make when they're negotiating? Besides something maybe that we've already talked about. Or maybe you could even tell us a story about a mistake you made negotiating and maybe what you learned from it. So either way.
Sure. And I'll answer it in both regards, and I'll hearken back to my mom's advice, or, that other guy named Shakespeare. I think the biggest mistake one can make is to not comport oneself, to not conduct discussions, to not approach these situations in a manner that is true to oneself. And I don't know that I can point to a particular mistake. Oh, yes, I can. I can point to a great mistake I made. Oh my God, it was
a
huge.
Good one. Awesome.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest for a moment that I didn't make a zillion mistakes over the course of my career, because I did. I was just stumped for the moment and thinking of one. But I will say that as a general rule, I believe mistakes in that regard are made when people try to act, again, to be someone or something they're not. But I made a lot of mistakes over the course of my career. And again, I'll harken back to something I said at the beginning. We all make mistakes over the course of our careers. What differentiated me in some regards from others is I stayed in one place for almost 30 years. So those mistakes stayed with me. I didn't work someplace for a couple of years, make a lot of mistakes, and then move on someplace else and leave those mistakes behind. They were there with me. And one of the big mistakes that I made had to do with a negotiation. And I simply misread a situation. I misread that which the person with whom we were speaking was trying to convey to me. I just didn't pick up on something that was, I guess, from this party's standpoint, a take it or leave it, or, I don't know how to articulate it, but I misread a situation and we did not get that deal done. We ultimately got a separate, different deal done, but my mistake cost the organization a lot of money. And I walked into Al's office and he was looking at something. I think he was watching practice on the screen. And I waited till at least it looked to me like he could take a little break. And I told him I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and that it cost us a lot of money. And he didn't look up and he didn't say anything. And I stood there for a while and I finally walked out. And I did it again the next day. And I said, look, we've really got to talk about this. I made a colossal mistake. I misjudged a situation and it cost us a ton of money. And he didn't say anything again. And it was either that day or the next day when I tried again. And I said, if you want to fire me, I understand. The final time I did it, which I was either the third or fourth day, I think the third, I walked in, I said the exact same thing, only I added at the end, look, let me make this easy for you. If you don't want to fire me, I will fire myself. And he finally looked up and he said, you made a mistake. I'm not firing you. No one's firing you. You made a mistake. You're not going to make it again. And then as I was walking out, I heard him start to laugh. And he said, you'll make other ones. And he was absolutely right.
Sure.
And I think that's so important in a business environment that we recognize we're all going to make mistakes. I mean, look, my brother and sister are doctors. If one of them screams, oh no, in the middle of a procedure, that could be a really big mistake.
Sure.
I had the privilege of flying with the Air Force in a fighter jet. Now, I'll quickly note I was in the back seat. I wasn't actually the one flying it. And if the pilot had made an error when we were upside down and going 500 miles an hour and pulling 6 Gs, that could be a deadly mistake. But for the most part in business, we can fix our mistakes. And I'm a big fan of raising your hand when you make a mistake and saying to your coworkers, I made a mistake. I need you to help me fix it. Mm-hmm. I did that with coworkers all the time, and I encourage them to do it with me.
Tell me this really quickly. In that moment, when you made that mistake, when you look back and reflect on it, what could you have done differently in that moment to have read that situation more effectively?
I think I could have been a little more intuitive, perhaps, or tried to understand better the understated or silent points the person was trying to make. I think I never stopped to think, is this person trying to convey something silently or subtly that I'm not understanding? Because I don't really do subtle. I should take the word really out. I don't do subtle. I am direct. I am told I'm direct to a fault. I don't believe there is such a thing. But I guess, boy, that's another question no one has ever asked me. And it's very, very thought-provoking. As I think through your question, the answer is I should have recognized that other people aren't as direct or aren't direct at all. And I should have looked for nuances and subtleties.
So, Amy, we end with rapid fire. So I'm going to fire off some questions to you, and you can be direct.
Great. I love rapid fire.
All right. One word to describe yourself.
If I could beg leeway and go with 2 words, I'll harken back to what we talked about earlier, and I'll say behavior problem.
Okay. A person you would most like to meet?
Rosa Parks.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
Well, it's bigger than a pet peeve, but people who are unkind.
What's your biggest fear?
Losing someone I love.
What's your most memorable career moment so far?
The moment that Zach Crockett scored and I realized we were going to the Super Bowl.
So the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who is a game changer, or what is a game changer that inspires you and why?
I would say my parents, and I'll focus for a moment on my mom. She graduated in 1947 with a undergraduate degree in chemistry. And as you can imagine, not many women did that. I believe she was the only one at the time in her class. And she went on to get multiple additional degrees and has changed the lives of many kids with what she chose to do over her career.
Well, that's awesome. That's cool. Amy, you are a gift, and thank you for joining us.
No, thank you. I mean, you ask amazing questions. I've had so many conversations with people, none of whom have asked the thought-provoking questions you did. It's almost like you have a talent at this or something.
Well, I tell you what, to have you on as a woman and as someone who has written about negotiation, it really is a pleasure, and a woman that's worked in sports and led in sports. So thank you for what you do.
And right back at you.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.